Hello and welcome to We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their issues, their concerns, their triumphs on We Caribbean. I'm your host, Doris Polo. 5 months after presidential elections led to a political stalemate in Guyana, Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali was sworn in as the new president. The ceremony was held on August 2nd, hours after Guyana's Elections Commission declared Ali's People's Progressive Party Civic the winner. GECOM made the announcement following the submission of a report by Chief Elections Officer Keith Lowenfield, who used the recount figure as stipulated by the courts. Lowenfield is out on bail and is facing 3 criminal charges relating to fraud, misconduct, and breach of public trust for providing false results. For his part, former President David Granger said he was considering an election petition, given the long list of irregularities. The political crisis saw widespread protests, numerous legal proceedings, and economic sanctions imposed on former President David Granger, his family, and his allies by the United States. Joining us to discuss the way forward for the South American country, which has experienced an enormous oil boom, are Peter Wickham, pollster for the Caribbean Development Research Services, and political analyst Dr. David Hines. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Hines, my first question is to you. I mean, the declaration of these results, it has been a really long time coming. What can we expect to see going forward with this new government?
Well, the new government is going to try, I think, to impose itself as quickly as possible, because I think it would be aware that it will be fighting against time. And I say that because I think it is only a matter of time before we see protests again from the opposition. I think we've had a lull in momentum from the opposition side because they are engaged in their own internal soul searching, as is normally the case when a party loses an election. And I think the government is quite aware of that. So it is trying to put itself in place in anticipation of that. And you see it making moves at the top of the police force, because the police force is going to be very crucial in this next era. You see it going into the ministries and exposing alleged irregularities. So they're moving very quickly because they know that this quote-unquote honeymoon is going to be very short. So I think they're preparing for what I anticipate is really going to be a prolonged confrontation.
It's interesting that you would have mentioned the police being involved, because we've seen a number of people being arrested aligned to the APNO AFC government. So, Mr. Wickham, I have to ask you, do you think that these arrests that we've been seeing in recent weeks is in any way politically motivated, or is it really just generally the police service doing its job?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, because I mean, all of the individuals would have been politically exposed. You have the Lowenfield and Mingo, who are technically speaking not they're public servants. They're not political operatives. But I think we generally agree that they appear to have been operating in a political way. And I think that the fact that the two have been charged, first privately, and now apparently the charges have been taken over by the DPP, to me, it was entirely expected. And I said all along that I felt that there was concern over their prosecution that may have had a lot to do with the fact that this process took as long as it did. I was a bit surprised to hear that Valda Lawrence was being charged, that she was being charged with conspiracy, I believe is the charge that they brought against her. She would be one of the political operatives that has surprised me, the fact that there's a charge against her. And then the other gentleman, who I believe was a minister, where they raided his house and found, barbarian supplies of some sort. Again, I mean, I'm not sure why he would have found it necessary to have those supplies at his house after an election has been called such a long time ago. A number of people to me were asking for trouble, and I think that he would have been in a situation like that. I really would prefer Guyana to get on with the business of rebuilding and not to be going after people in the former administration. But I'm also appreciative of the fact that it's a reality of life that politicians will have to settle a few scores. And I think that the fact that it has only been them and not more is something that we can take some comfort in.
Yeah. Now, under the former CARICOM chair, Mia Motley, the bloc demanded a swift resolution to the political deadlock. The question really arises now, was CARICOM, Dr. Hines, a toothless dog in this matter? What else could have been done?
Well, hindsight is a hell of a thing. Obviously, CARICOM was part of a larger plot of regime change. I think that has become obvious now when we see the moves that the government has made since. We see the moves that the Americans have made vis-a-vis this government, and the moves that the government has made vis-a-vis the Americans is very clear that regime change. I mean, Guyana, the new Guyana government has now fallen in line in terms of taking the side of the opposition in Venezuela as against the side of Maduro, which is a big shift in Guyana's foreign policy. And the American government announced with glee that Guyana is now on their side. And there are other things that are coming out. I think CARICOM got caught in that. And so therefore, there is going to be a period when I think the relations between Guyana and CARICOM would have to be ironed out. But as of now, as you've noticed, the CARICOM leadership they're not saying anything in relation to Guyana. I think they've done what they set out to do, and that's over and they've moved on.
Yeah, most definitely. And Mr. Wickham, you spoke, well, we heard Dr. Hines mention the foreign policy. How does this government's policy differ as it relates to, Guyana, this new administration, from the Granger government?
Well, I mean, I was a bit surprised to hear Dr. Lewis speak to this whole Guyana, Venezuela situation just now. I had no idea that has been changed, that the policy had been changed. If it has been changed, it is now inconsistent with the rest of CARICOM, because the rest of CARICOM has been very clear in support of Maduro. I didn't realize that Guyana's government went in a different direction. But my more important concern now is less about that and more about the whole idea of the broader foreign policy. I think the Guyana government now has the capacity to articulate a foreign policy that essentially can coordinate, collaborate, can work with partners in the Caribbean, partners internationally, the ABC countries. They can sit down and work with them. The reality is that I wouldn't say that it differs significantly from the other administration, but I think that what is fundamentally different is that you can actually speak to these people. I do not believe the Granger administration would have been in a position to have any kind of bilateral talks with America, the United Kingdom, Canada, anyone in the Caribbean, simply because he lacked the legitimacy to do so. I do feel, however, that the current administration has that legitimacy and it enables them to chart a course. So let's say if we don't agree that there's any fundamental substantive difference with the philosophical position, I think that there definitely is a difference in that this government can now engage with all of its partners regionally and internationally in a way that the other government under President Granger could not. Certainly Dr. Hines is saying it's regime change. I think the reality is that these governments were taking a position that was consistent with what they thought was fundamentally right. And I can't have an argument with that.
Yeah, but just to clarify, when they had the inauguration, the entire ceremony, the swearing in on, it would have been August 2nd, Dr. Ali mentioned basically the same position as it relates to Venezuela. However, I feel like this government might be more so aligned with the United States than the Granger government. Now, I want to pick up where you left off, Mr. Wickham, and go to Dr. Hines. The country, with the oil find, Guyana is undoubtedly, expected to have the fastest growing economy in the hemisphere. But it begs the question now, how will it affect the way it relates with other CARICOM countries and how other nations internationally perceive Guyana? Because it was always this small island, this poor country, and now it's quite different.
Well, yes, Guyana is going to play a big role. I mean, as far as geopolitics are concerned, as far as hemispheric politics are concerned. But the question of how it deals, that is, the Guyana government deals with the outer world as far as oil is concerned, is already an issue, because supporters of the new government are now only after 3 weeks, are beginning to criticize the government because the PPP had said that it would renegotiate the oil contracts when it was in opposition. And a lot of people supported it on that ground. And now, coming to power, within the first 2 weeks, it said, no, we're not renegotiating the oil contracts. And the oil interests in Guyana, which supported them, are saying, but you fooled us because you told us that you were going to renegotiate the oil contract. So one of the daily newspapers, for example, the Kaichor News, which was very, very, very supportive of this new government coming to power, but that newspaper has been a harsh critic of the last government for not negotiating with the oil companies in the interest of Guyanese. And they broke with that government, the coalition, to support the PPP, the understanding that was what the PPP was going to do. But now the PPP, as I said, has come to power and decided it's not going to renegotiate those contracts. So the PPP government is caught between its commitment to the United States and the other ABC countries that it will not interfere with the oil operations and the oil contract, and supporters at home who believed that it was going to come in to renegotiate those contracts. So that's where things are at the moment. And I think it's going to blow up even louder as the weeks and months go by.
Yeah, I mean, we know Barjagdeo during the campaign and then after the elections when there was the political stalemate, he mentioned that any oil company that would have struck a deal with the Granger administration was going to be blacklisted, and then we haven't heard anything, as you mentioned. With that, we'll take a short break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion with Peter Wickham and Dr. David Hines as we do our post-op on Guyana going forward. Stay with us.
The Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali examines the mass media influence promoted by imperialism. Get access to the analysis of the socio-economic and political life of the whole South America on our screen and platform in English. A critical place committed to the truth to determine the major events that transform the world today. Mondays, only on Telesur.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life. Fridays. Only on Telesur. Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough, and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomy. Monday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Mr. Wickham, I'd like to continue our discussion on Guyana's new government with you, CARICOM Chair Dr. Ralph Gonsalves. He condemned the political crisis and he also challenged the new government in his Emancipation Day message to bring a resolution to the assassination of Walter Rodney. He was killed, of course, you would know it, on June 13th, 1980, and then 40 years later. What can this administration do?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and probably Dr. Hines is in a better position to answer it. I think that the previous administration has made an effort to come to some conclusion in that regard. There was a fairly expensive commission of inquiry into the matter. As far as I know, that came up short, and there's no clear recommendation. And it's useful that Dr. Gonzalez has reminded the administration that this needs to be a priority. As to where they can go with this matter, that's something that I'm really unsure about.
If I may,
Dr. Hines,
yes, if I may. Well, there was a commission of inquiry under this government that's here now, but when they were there the last time. And as soon as the coalition government came in, it brought the inquiry to an abrupt end, much to the consternation of one of its partners, the Working People's Alliance, which is Rodney's party, and really did nothing about, it was tabled in Parliament, but that was it. They've never officially published the report. They did not act on the recommendations coming out of the report. So if this government is serious about Walter Rodney, it can do those things. It can officially publish the report. And secondly, it can implement the recommendations of the report. And one of the recommendations of the report is the depoliticization of the police force, that Guyana should have professional police force. And this government, as I mentioned earlier, as soon as it came to power, continues, and I think to another level, the politicization of the police force. So in that sense, the government is acting against the recommendations of the Rodney report. So I do not think the Walter Rodney issue is high up on the agenda of this government, but who knows?
Yeah, and we also saw there was an incident in 2015, I would like to think, with Mr. Ewing, who was killed, an activist of some sort for the APNU AFC, and there was no resolution brought to that either. Now, how can, and this question goes out to both of you, how can this new government ensure that citizens benefit from this oil boom? Because we've asked this question before.
Yeah, but I mean, if I can go first. I think it's fairly clear that Guyana has to learn from the lesson of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a useful opportunity to learn mistakes that may have been made in terms of distribution of oil wealth. My sense is that that's something that they have to have learned, and if they have, they'll be in a better position to ensure that all sectors benefit. I remember President Granger early on said that he felt that health and education, I believe, were the two sectors that he identified, should benefit significantly from oil wealth. I don't think that anyone can argue with that. Certainly, health and education are two things that, generally speaking, people will always agree on. And I think if there's one policy that ought to be continued, it's that. I think the other thing that they need to be very wary of is not to let Guyanese believe that, no, the oil has been found, everyone gets a free ride, no one has to work any longer. That would be a grave error. And I feel that they need to keep activities going. The one thing that I was happy about that the new administration has announced is that they are going to pursue a level of diversity, especially as it relates to non-oil production of energy. So they're looking to go back into hydroelectric. I thought that the end of the Amira Falls project was unfortunate. I believe that that is the kind of project that will help to bring the level of diversity, especially now the oil prices are at a historic low in terms of Guyana's future. So I think that a balance in terms of oil and in terms of other zero carbon emission type energy generation as would come from the falls would be the kind of thing that I hope that they would go into. And then, as I said, learn from the mistakes of Trinidad and Tobago and try to ensure that there is a reasonable distribution of the oil wealth and that it touches vulnerable sectors like health and education.
Yeah. Dr. Hines, there's undoubtedly a racial divide in Guyana. Can this new government temper those issues? No, and I'm very glad, because that's where I was going. So you, as they say, you read my mind. Look, the issue over the elections was the issue of the distribution of oil wealth, and that remains a significant issue. As soon as it came back to power, the government has announced that it will reopen the sugar industries, the sugar estates that were closed. The previous government had downsized
the sugar industry by closing some estates. The new government has said that it will reopen those estates. Now, the downsizing came about because Guyana was producing sugar far way above what it costs for other countries to produce. And so the government was heavily subsidizing the industry. Now, with the reopening of the estates, and the sugar industry is 90%, perhaps more than that, people by Indian Guyanese. And so therefore, it would mean that the subsidizing of the sugar industry will continue, and that it is clear where a lot of the oil revenues will go. And so that is a way of ethnically funneling oil revenues to one group in the society. And that is already causing a lot of disquiet in the country. And the other thing is that Guyana ideologically remains a kind of left of center country, slightly different from the other Caribbean countries, because the major parties in Guyana, for all intents and purposes, old socialist parties. The PPP was in a communist party. And so the question of what happens to the working class becomes a very important issue. One of the parties in the coalition, the WP, had put forward a proposal for cash transfers to households as a means of adding to their income coming from the oil wealth. And it generated a lot of discussion in the country. The coalition eventually reluctantly embraced it, but they never campaigned on it. And some analysts believe that it's one of the reasons it came up short in terms of votes. And the PPP has now put that on the table, and it has committed itself to some form of cash transfer. So there are going to be debates around how the revenues are distributed from the standpoint of social class and from the standpoint of ethnicity and race.
Most definitely. We have a lot to look forward to in Guyana. Mr. Wickham, before we go, as we've run out of time, I must ask you, Jamaica has elections set for September 3rd. We also see that a snap election was called in Bermuda. That would be October 1st, almost 2 years before it's actually constitutionally due. We're seeing a trend in the Caribbean. What are your thoughts on this, and what can you explain to our viewers as far as what we can look forward to?
I mean, it's the COVID effect, and certainly I've been commenting on it for a while now, that COVID has created a very unstable future for most Caribbean countries, and indeed most countries anywhere in the world. As a result, any person who has the option to call an election early will do so, because you can mitigate the short-term effects of COVID far more easily than the long-term effects. Bermuda is a country that is heavily dependent on tourism and heavily dependent on offshore investment. I mean, all of that has virtually collapsed in much the same way that it has across the rest of the region. And our Westminster system, as it stands now, allows a prime minister to call an election whenever he or she feels like. And any election, any Caribbean country where elections are due, they will call it up early. So Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, I wouldn't be surprised if they called their election earlier than planned. And then, yeah, of course, the Bermuda has now gone to the polls as well. And it makes good political sense, because it means that you only have to speak to your population about the short-term effects of COVID. When 6 months from now, planes are still not flying and tourism-dependent economies are still suffering, you don't have to explain that to your population, because it will be harder then to explain to them why they're still not working. So it's good politics, and because we have the option to call elections early, ultimately we are.
It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Mr. Wickham and Dr. Hines. With that, we've come to the end of this week's episode of We Caribbean. I am Doris Polo. To keep up with news and more, go to our website, telesurenglish.net, or join us on social media. See you next week.